All right, great. Thank you very much for joining us all. We've got quite a few participants in already. And so I'd like to say good morning to all, and I'm Vanda Vickers, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at GRI. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on quantum readiness for the financial sector. We'll be exploring what it will take to be quantum ready and quantum safe. We have 4 leading experts joining us on the topic of quantum, and each of them will bring a pragmatic view of where we can take the financial sector and all of our sectors from a readiness point of view. We'll begin our remarks from each of our speakers, and then we'll move to a Q&A component with them, which I'll moderate. Before we begin, please note that your microphones as attendees have been muted to avoid background noise. And if you do have a question or comment, please go to the chat box, type in your question, and you can either address it to me as a host. That would probably be the best. Thank you very much. So with those instructions out of the way, I would like to fully introduce our guests. I'm keeping an eye out for Bob, who may have ended up in the attendee panel. So give me a second to make sure that he isn't there. Okay, all right. So I'll start with Michele Mosca. Michele, who's been a long-time supporter and collaborator for GRI on cybersecurity. Michele holds a doctorate in mathematics from Oxford and did his doctorate on the topic of quantum computer algorithms. He's a professor at Waterloo and joined the faculty more than 10 years ago. 20 years ago, I would say now. And then he conducts research in quantum algorithms, quantum software, and cryptographic tools. Steve Hawkins, who's also on the screen with us today, welcome Steve, is Scotiabank's Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, and SVP of Information Security and Controls. He brings over 35 years of experience to these roles and leads a team of over 700 information security professionals that protect over 1.2 trillion in assets and information for 25 million customers across 35 countries. Currently is delivering Scotia's transformation to a digital bank through key strategic and strategies aimed at keeping systems and consumers safe. Jaya Balu, who's also on the screen with us this morning. Jaya is Avast Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, and joined Avast in October 2019. She was the CISO at KPN, which is the largest telco and carrier in the Netherlands. And she's also working in this field for and a focus on network security architecture for over 20 years. And just in time is Bob Blakely. And I'm going to introduce Bob. He's an operating partner at Team 8. He was previously Global Director of Information Security and Innovation at Citi. And he's worked and served as the member of the National Academy of Science Committee on Technical Assessment of the Feasibility and Implications of Quantum Computing. So welcome to our esteemed colleagues and panelists. As I mentioned to you, we've got an hour together, or about 50 minutes, and we'll be going through and talking about quantum computing. So I'm going to start with Michele, and Michele, as you just recently wrote another installment on the quantum threat timeline. And for our audience, we have close to 200 participants online today, just to give you an idea of who's here. And we've got about 29 companies that are GRI and PH members, eight different academic communities represented in this call, and over 47 interested parties who follow GRI just through our social media and our newsletters. So great to see that much interest in this topic. We won't be covering the, what quantum computers are, how they work. If you'd like to learn more about that, I'd really encourage you to read the first 13 riveting pages for sure Michele's document and manuscript, because it actually is a very, very good and easy to understand synopsis. But just to give everybody a high level, quantum computers use quantum systems, to really run computations that go way beyond what traditional computers can do today. So with that, Michele, I think with the latest the findings on the report, I think give you a few minutes to talk to all of us about what this installment has told us.
Well, thanks a lot, Vanda. It's just great to be here with my wonderful colleagues. So with regards, comparing this year's report to last year's what's changed. Well, one thing, we doubled the number of respondents. Just further, still all great established world leaders in the different aspects of quantum computing that will really impact when it will be able to break today's public key cryptography. So more, larger sample, a little more diversity. So that's I think a great development. So last year's report, we asked people to predict what they thought was a likelihood of achieving so-called quantum supremacy. And the overwhelming view was it would happen relatively soon, right? Half thought it was at least 70% likely or higher within a year, and 19 out of 22 thought it was more than 70% likely and within 3 years. But I think there's great expectation that this was happening quite soon. In fact, it happened a few weeks after we finished collecting our data, so that prediction, came out to be quite true. We also asked them, like, what does it matter anyway, right? From the spectrum of it's just a gimmick, it doesn't matter at all, to the floodgates are open and now the full power of quantum computing is being unleashed. There was a prevailing view that it was somewhere in the middle, and that it was certainly significant and important demonstration, an important technological feat, which demonstrated a lot of the important elements of building a fault-tolerant computer that would impact cryptography. But that in itself, nothing was good. No need to panic. Things aren't broken today, but we're certainly moving. That's a significant demonstration in that direction, right? And a logical qubit, just to clarify, because it's an important concept for this field, we think it's, quantum bits are going to be error prone. So the likelihood of factoring a large number using bits that are likely to, flip at any particular time is pretty low. We need to take hundreds or thousands of these bits and collectively encode one logical bit, the kind of bit we would program in. And so the fault-tolerant logical bit is effectively an error-free bit for the, at least significantly error-free, that you can effect the computation reliably. And again, physically it means these qubits, whether they're superconducting qubits or spins, you collect hundreds or thousands of them, perform error-correcting code computations on them, and collectively they're an effective good bit, right? And another thing on the supremacy, so-called supremacy front, is that's happened since our report. Even the latest report is China demonstrated its own version of a so-called quantum supremacy. It's different. I won't get into the details, but the message still holds that it was an important achievement. Now let's go on to the next milestone. So this year's report, we moved to what I think is the most important milestone towards the cryptographically relevant quantum computer. And that's this logical qubit. So we asked people, when do you think it's going to happen? And 30 out of 44 said it's about 50% likely within 3 years. Right. And a significant number thought it was reasonably likely even within a year. So this is starting to feel much more real. This is the most real I've ever heard it articulated. And then IBM, a few weeks after we finished collecting our data, said, to publish its roadmap, and it's 2023 on its roadmap. So this is all, there seems to be a prevailing view this is likely to happen quite soon. And so, I think that'll be a really critical milestone, because then a lot of the uncertainty will start to vanish, and we'll have a much clearer picture of when we'll have cryptographically relevant quantum computers. Because then it's largely enters a scaling. The focus will be on scaling these into, instead of 1 or 10, to about 4,000 or a few thousand, which can break the foundations or our current foundations of our cryptography. The view on when, if we have a fault-tolerant qubit in 3 years, how long will it take to break RSA? 5 years, 10 years? Like, those are generally the range that most people are thinking. So with regards to breaking RSA 2048, in the short term, things didn't move a lot. It's still about 1 in 4, thought it was about 50% likely in 10 years. And we'll see how, the people in banking, how nervous that kind of risk makes them. They weren't significant. I don't want to overread, the statistical fluctuations here, except I do think there was a notable greater confidence of breaking RSA in the medium to long term, which could be tied to the greater confidence that we're going to get a fault-tolerant qubit soon, and then it's a question of how long will it take to scale it to be cryptographically relevant. Another thing we probed was COVID. We thought it was natural to ask, how is this going to change things? Is it going to slow things down? Are people going to pull the plug on funding or what? Overall, we don't, at least in the short term, we didn't sense a massive impact. On the theory side, not much, because we're working just fine at home. It did impact experiments a bit, but not, some not much, some by several months. It really depends on how easy they were able to access their labs. And some, pointed to benefits. We could now think, reevaluate, they had more time to ponder and strategize about their approaches. And on the impact on funding, again, there were some views, but I think we're generally seeing continuing doubling down on quantum around the world as part of stimulus packages. Again, there's a range of views, but that was a common theme. And that's sort of a summary of where things sit on the threat side. I will highlight some changes in the last year on the preparation side. And I like the way Katie Taylor put things in the more abstract, not for quantum specifically, but success is 10% strategy and 90% execution. But she said execution is 90% planning and 10% doing. And in the last year, we've seen a vast acceleration on the planning and preparation side. There's more and more of these kinds of much more action-oriented webinars and workshops. Swift just is holding one. Lloyd's is holding one on the insurance, how it impacts insurance and the boards of insurance companies. The Canadian ISED, our Innovation, Science and Economic Development department, co-founded a Canadian Forum for Digital Infrastructure Resilience, which is again further developing and working on this and articulating, what we were converging on 6 stages of getting ready for cyber systems: preparation, discovery, risk assessment, mitigation, migration, and validation. And I think we're seeing 2 inflection points that are coming really soon. The NIST standardization, so that we're going to have solutions, standardized solutions to do the mitigation, and this logical qubit on the threat side. And a few more years down the road, but still approaching soon, is the emergence of long distance commercial grade quantum cryptography. So I think with these key milestones in the short term, it's really critical. We are well along that 90% planning path, like near the final stages of that planning within a year or two before those 2 soon milestones, the earlier milestones appear. So that's my hopefully quick summary of what's transpired in the last 12 months.
So lots and lots has really moved forward when you look back and you compare where we were when we actually convened a forum on this in late 2019. So I'm going to move it over to Steve. So Steve, as the CISO of one of our large Canadian banks with extensive responsibilities in this area, tell me a little bit about how you feel this and the financial system in Canada are moving along in this readiness path. What are the areas that you're focused on?
Thank you, Vonda. It's interesting, the banks, we have a lot of old systems, right? So, we got into IT in the early days. Some of the systems were written when I was still in school. That was a long time ago. And you know, if you look at the cryptography that's embedded in them, like all our systems have cryptography in some way or form. We also use public key infrastructure extensively, so we can have secure remote access to our systems and things like that. So when you look at this landscape of what's coming at us, it's similar to, in a way, the Y2K problem that says at some point in time in the future, there's going to be this thing you have to deal with. And the question is, how are you going to deal with it? But you're going to have to deal with it across all of your systems pretty much at the same time. You know, in this case, we've got a little bit more latitude because not all of our systems handle the most sensitive data. But, you know, it starts with what Michele was talking about, which is making sure we have an accurate and reliable inventory of all our systems and the nature of the cryptography they're using today, right? What are the hashing algorithms, the key lengths, the cryptographic algorithms, and gathering that data and putting it in a repository so that we've got an inventory that maps back to perhaps our target state. Of course, we can't start making changes to remediate anything because we don't have those quantum resistant algorithms yet. So we're in hurry up and wait mode, but thank goodness to the work that's been going on by NIST and the competition and all the work that's going on there. I mean, they're hoping that round 3 is going to be done later on this year. At the end of this year, I believe, is the target to have some recommended candidates. You know, once those candidates are recommended, they have to be accepted. And of course, we don't just write our own software. We use a lot of commercial software from other third-party companies to run our business. And we do a lot more of that now than we ever have in the past. So, you know, all the independent software vendors are going to have to take what comes out of this and decide how to upgrade their systems to migrate to cryptography that is quantum resistant so that the data that's being encrypted by them is protected from potential future attacks. It's interesting. The other thing I think of is the fact that the rate of development in the last while has accelerated, I think, is my sense as well, from watching this over a long period of time, that it's really starting to pick momentum. And as you start to see all of these companies who are making investments in tools and development libraries and languages, and, you know, positioning them that they're going to obfuscate the complexity of communicating with the hardware, and so that people can start working with the tools and development languages now and do things in parallels, so that as the hardware continues to evolve and solve some of the problems that are still being worked on, people are already picking up how to start thinking about these programming languages and the programming. And so that's, you know, democratizing the development of quantum computing even before we really have quantum computers fully readily available. And, you know, that's going to change. The other thing I've been thinking about as well is the fact that with cloud computing, a lot of these companies are planning on, or starting to offer pseudo quantum, but planning on offering quantum computers available through the cloud. So you don't have to buy a quantum computer. You'll be able to just rent some time on it, which makes it much more available to lots of people. And when we have lots of people engaged, we find that sometimes the innovation goes much more rapidly because we're leveraging the brain power of many more people in this game. So it's something we all need to take seriously, but it starts with, you know, those processes Michele was talking about, which is you've got to know what you have, you've got to know where your data is, you got to know how you're protecting it, and prioritize remediation. We're going to start tracking that in our what we call our security risk index. That's one of our additions we're going to add to it. We measure lots of things, but we're going to start measuring the extent to which we have remediated our cryptography to address this threat as time goes on.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's a good view of the things you're focused on, and in a fairly, I would say, pragmatic way inside of a fairly complex environment, as you mentioned. You know, many companies, not just our companies here in Canada, will be dealing with legacy systems, current systems, cloud environments, third-party ecosystem. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to move in a direction to make sure that things are continue to be secure. I'll stay on the security front a bit and maybe move it to Jaya for her to make a few comments also. Jaya, you've been involved in this. You've been on the EU Flagship steering committee. Tell us a little bit of the things that you've been focused on and that you feel are you know, what's your view of what to worry about, when to worry? What are those things?
Hi, so just from the flagship, it has a really different role. The flagship is there to make sure that Europe doesn't fall behind, both in terms of innovation and advancement, as well as in terms of getting its own defenses ready in order to embrace the possibilities of quantum computing, even if that doesn't necessarily come from a European innovation hub. So really trying to play both sides of it. In terms of information assurance, as well as like making sure that we're ready to. I'm sorry, can you hear me well? I'm just.
I think it's you're a little bit, yeah. Try to get a little closer, or maybe. Yeah.
It could be that I'm wearing like a microphone that I was trying to conceal, but is this better?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, it was the conceal bit of the microphone. But to go back, what we're trying to figure out with the flagship is how do we retain this competitive advantage? I mean, we haven't been very quiet about the fact that we really have a very strong ambition. So if you take a look at the global quantum market today in terms of all of the quantum technologies, quantum computing, quantum communication, sensing and metrology, and quantum simulation, these are all different fields where Europe would like to have a leadership role. That being said, a lot of the leadership that's happening is really being dominated for a large part by the United States and China. You know, that's how we see, and Europe is there in the top three. But our ambition in the next 7 years is to be in the top two. That's not a small ambition, because that means you're either beating out the US or China, who both have a sort of Moneyball-like game to play in terms of putting resources and people at these different problems. So it's really not a small goal. That being said, we have, you know, the thing that I did for the flagship was really look at establishing the KPIs for what are the things that we're aiming for and how is the flagship doing in terms of actually getting us there. Part of that is not just that innovation place, but also to make sure that we are ready. And if you see it from a European perspective, we've got some fundamental challenges to overcome. Because we are not the United States of Europe, you know, we don't have that complete cohesion amongst the different nation states. So it becomes really difficult to articulate a security strategy for getting ready in terms of QKD or PQC, so quantum key distribution or post-quantum cryptography in one unified way. And we do see people in certain geographies doing things that are really smart. So if I have to think of a banking example, I'm going to take one close to home. I'm not sure if you're familiar, Steve, have you ever heard of the ABN AMRO Bank? ABN AMRO? Okay, so good. So ABN AMRO, for example, has put quantum computing as one of their top 3 innovation priorities for the next decade. And that's both looking at what opportunities does computing bring, but also really strongly, if you just Google this, you'll see that they take this very seriously. They have 3 areas where they're very strongly focused. One is quantum computing, the other one is on AI and emotion AI, and the third is AI and adversarial networks, so generative adversarial networks. So if they have these 3 areas, you know, it's a very strong focus for the bank in terms of where they're putting their money and which bets they're taking for their own security and innovation for the future. And this is really good. But you see that a lot of the incumbent thinking, if you will, for a lot of the more established players in Europe is not along these lines. They are far slower on the uptake, which means that I feel we will not be ready when we do have these advancements, of when we do have a quantum computer that is relevant to the state of cryptography. The first problem begins that most companies in Europe have no idea what their cryptographic assets are. So where do we use cryptography and why, and what does that really mean to our core business? That's the first issue. The second issue is that even if they did know what they use, they don't know all the components of where they get it from. So their actual cryptographic supply chain is something that's like hidden in obscurity. That means in order for them to actually be secure, it's not a organizational only effort. It's something that would need to be further down the chain with supplier security annexes, the things that we already do to make sure that our forward-facing contracts are backwards compliant, we don't necessarily do right now for everything we need to get ready for. So having this proactive approach to suppliers is really important. And, you know, you'll see this stuff kind of come back when Europe has taken a position on, for example, 5G. You know, there we're particularly strong in what we want in terms of security protection. we don't necessarily apply that through to all of the other types of players that we have. So a lot of this incumbent thinking in Europe is something that we still have as a major hurdle to get over, but I would say, learn from other people's mistakes in this one. This is something that you can prepare for. And if we go back to that planning example, just, making sure you have a plan so you don't plan to fail, I think is fundamental here. If we focus on planning, I think everyone will be fine.
Thanks, Jaya. And Bob, let's pivot to you and talk a little bit about the opportunities and how do we get ready for the opportunities. I think that's been a theme that you've been discussing. So over to you and tell us a little bit about how do we get ready for the opportunity side of this.
Sure. Thank you. And can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Number one, a pleasure to see all of my colleagues, and they've all given excellent advice on how to plan, among other things, for the downside of quantum technology. And I've put a lot of attention on that too. But what I'm here to really talk about today is I think if we were able to get in our time machine and go 50 years into the future or 100 years into the future, what we would find is that the effect of quantum technology is going to be overwhelmingly on the upside rather than on the downside, right? We will get over these transitional issues and threats to security. And after we've done that, we will start using the technology, and I suspect that it will be transformational in a degree almost as great as conventional computing. So I guess so then the question becomes, okay, so we've talked about planning for the downside of quantum technology. What do you do about planning for the upside? And I guess canonically, the first thing that you do to plan for the upside of a brand new technology is you expose, a bunch of middle schoolers to it and bring them along so that it is a familiar technology when they get to the point when they're in college and when they're in the workforce, right? So the really education and workforce development is going to be absolutely key to all aspects of exploitation of quantum technology. And people are starting to work on these kinds of issues, on education and workforce issues. So, for example, there is an organization called the National Quantum Literacy Network, which you could look at. There are quantum initiatives, just all over the place. But I guess I also want to say two sets of other things. The first thing is, when we began developing the technology of motion pictures, what we had was basically film and a thing that would spin it around in front of a light bulb. And we didn't really know what it was for, right? So what happened was that a bunch of people got together and started experimenting with film in France and in Russia and what have you. And they developed a way of thinking about motion pictures and what it would mean to create an artifact that was native to that medium. And a guy named Sergei Eisenstein in Russia got the credit for this. It was actually a bunch of his female film editors who developed all of these ideas, and he just got out in front and gave the talks. But he developed, together with some French input, this notion of the montage theory of motion pictures. So a similar thing happened in computing, right? So when the very first computer began to be built by Charles Babbage, he built a machine, but Ada Augusta, the Countess of Lovelace, decided that it was going to be necessary to use the machine to do something, and she developed the technology of programming the machine. And it was a long set of steps between Ada Augusta's programs and Alan Turing's model of what a computer program would look like on the one hand, that was one giant step. And then another giant step was, once you have this idea of a Turing computer, how do you develop all of the algorithms that you need? And that eventually led us to, Knuth's volume of books on algorithms, right? So we are currently, so we already have had the sort of Ada Augusta moment, right? We had Peter Shor and we had Grover, who have developed the first quantum algorithms, but we do not yet have the Alan Turing, who has given us an abstraction of how quantum computing works in general that we can use to build programming languages, and that we can then use to assess the efficiency of algorithms and build up the quantum Knuth volume. So that program, the academic program of figuring out what the fundamental nature of a digital quantum program is, and then the development of a set of algorithms that are building blocks for applications, that is all about education. It's all about research. It's all about workforce development, and all of that is going to be critically important to invest in. So while you're training people to ward off the quantum apocalypse, send some of them back to school to learn how to program quantum computers, and maybe they'll head off the quantum apocalypse, and that'll be nice. But maybe they'll develop a new optimization mechanism that will make your company $1 billion by making you the most efficient telco provider on Earth. Or maybe they'll produce a new material that allows us to produce nitrogen fertilizer 3 orders of magnitude more efficiently than we do now. And all of those things are really going to be where the action is.
There's a lot to harness, Bob, I think, is the high level. There's a lot to be learned, and there's a lot to harness. There's a couple of questions that are starting to come in from the group, but let me kick it off with one that's come in from one of our colleagues at the Bank of Canada, who seems that, and it's a good observation, there needs to be a massive amount of coordination, cooperation to address the threats, the opportunities, and I know there's a few things going on, but, do you see a role in the Canadian ecosystem? Whose role is it? And I know, Michele, you started a not-for-profit Quantum Safe. I know we've got a group of people who get together on a regular basis. Steve, I know there's some task forces that you're heading out. I think that we still a long way to go, but there are some coordination points happening today. Maybe I'll ask for each of you to comment on that. I'm going to start with Steve because it's more on the banking side, and then Michele on the wider side. How about do that way?
Well, it's interesting that a couple of years ago we got to know our good friend here from Waterloo, and what he was talking about, and we all have cryptographers working for us, most of whom have been to school there, right, at Waterloo. So it's a good type tie-in, and we started talking about this and decided, maybe we could work together to try and look at some of our systems and understand what would be involved, and take a trial run on assessing what would be required to transform a system from being quantum at risk to being quantum safe. Now, we have not managed to complete all that work, but it is something that we would still like to complete. And we are still continuing on with collaboration, cooperation, discussing things, talking about things, staying in touch, keeping close idea on things. But I think we're getting close to the point where we're going to be able to do some real meaningful work on taking something that's a real live system that we all rely on, and doing work on it to say what would be required to make that system quantum resilient. And I won't get into the details of the system. It's one that we all care about, but it's something that we're looking at taking another run at in the near future. I think it's really important for us to try and take some leadership in this area and try and encourage people to focus on it, because if it is going to be the wave of the future, we believe it's coming. It's an opportunity for us to, as Jaya was saying in relation to Europe, if we don't get in the game, we're going to be someone who's just consuming other people's services. And this is a great way to create meaningful opportunities and jobs for Canadians to play a meaningful role in this place. And I think that's something we need to figure out how better to do as a country.
Kelly, anything to add on that particular, on the wider side of the topic?
Very well said by Steve. I think the challenge is this is a collective problem. No one sector organization can single-handedly solve it. And typically with those problems, everybody just ignores them and focuses on their other problems. And until something really, really bad happens and we have a crisis. So we do need to work across all these sectors, which is why we formed the Quantum Safe Canada not-for-profit. I think that from a grassroots perspective, we've done quite a good job in Canada in creating awareness in the community, government, industry, different sectors, research. And I think what I'm seeing around the world is there's pockets of really deep thinking in the financial sector and really impressive work. So I think Canada's, in my unbiased opinion, a global leader, but there's other great pockets of excellence. Jaya mentioned our friends in the Netherlands banking community. There's great work happening in the United States as well, and a few other areas where, SWIFT is definitely studying this and so on. I think we're reaching in a time where we need to start sharing a lot of these practices and lessons, because there's no such thing as a resilient Canadian financial system or resilient American financial system or resilient Dutch or European. It's a global system. It's a global risk. And we need to build on this basis we've constructed, again, in various pockets around the world and do something with real global impact. I think Canada is a natural place, especially in the financial sector. We have a long legacy of moral leadership globally. So I think it's a real opportunity for Canada and the world here.
But do you feel there's any role for the public authorities in Canada to help? Is there any role there? That's a direct question from one of the attendees, to help the sector be more ready. I'll direct that one to Steve.
I think that the government can always play a good role in helping certain things. I mean, in the industry, we've been asking for the government to play a greater role in cybersecurity, and they have been stepping up lately, and it's been welcome to have that partnership. And I think that investing in and taking things, we want to get out of this pandemic situation we're in, and we have to invest money. Maybe instead of putting it towards building roads and bridges and things like that, maybe we should put some money towards green technology, quantum technology, and things like that the world is going to need in a big way in coming years. And if Bob's prediction is true that perhaps with a quantum computer we'll be able to come up with a way more efficient method of producing fertilizers or something like that can transform the world, that could be fantastic in terms of the outlook for the world, in terms of helping us address things like global warming and helping solve the waste of energy and the amount of carbon dioxide getting pumped into the atmosphere. And there's tons of problems that might be solved with that. And so the sooner we all get this capability up and running, the sooner we could perhaps start solving some more difficult problems besides how to crack our PKIs.
Well, looking at Canada from the outside, I would say there's a lot of potential for the government to do good work here. If I look back at what was done in privacy and identity by people like Anne Cavoukian at the national level and by the government of British Columbia, at the provincial level, that was really important work globally, right? And really innovative work. So I am hopeful. Given the resources that Canada has at Waterloo and in BC and elsewhere, in terms of expertise on the quantum issue, I think there's a lot of scope for marshaling those resources in a useful direction, and I am hopeful that Canada will do that.
Sorry, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm trying to go ahead, Jaya.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say something. Steve, I'm not sure if you have this in Canada, but one of the organizations that I used to work very heavily with, and it was the FS-ISAC, the Financial Services Information Sharing Community. And I believe that the one biggest problem we have is, even when all of this great work is done by NIST and we have vendors on the bandwagon ready to come and help and implement these new algorithms, we're going to have this slightly unstable moment where we're going to have to look for the problems that are there and then be able to respond very quickly with, decisive action and organize that effectively so all of those interdependent systems can work well. So in order to achieve that crypto agility and to I think there's a lot of work, not just from something that goes top down from the Canadian government or any government, but self-organizational capability that's required while we have this bake-off time to make sure that these algorithms and these techniques and then their actual implementation is trustworthy enough for us to declare them truly safe. So I'm a big fan of doing this kind of stuff yourself.
And on that note, it's interesting because I meet with the CISOs of the other Canadian banks more often than I meet with some people in my own bank, right? Like we meet on a monthly basis formally and on a monthly basis informally, and we have working groups, and we have collaborated on such a wide range of things over the years, everything from how do we better secure the payment system and what best practices should be adopted in that regard, working with the Bank of Canada about the resiliency of our payment systems. We have a very vibrant community amongst the security professionals, not just banks, but insurance companies and other financial sectors. And we collaborate on a number of things. And this is one of our regular subjects for discussion is how do we work together to solve these things. Interestingly enough, most of us are members of FS-ISAC as well. And we were just in discussions about spinning up an FS-ISAC chapter here in Canada right now to further embed that. And it's great when you work together as a community because you can't wait for the government. But all I was saying earlier on was I hope the government takes this opportunity that if they're going to be investing in things for the future, this is one of the things that should definitely be on the list of things worthy of investing in, right? Not just, solar power and green energy. Quantum computing is clearly one of the technologies of the future it's going to be here soon, and we should try and make sure we are actively contributing to that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Steve's view that one of the things government needs to do is make this part of the strategic innovation investments for our country, because that aligns really well with our security requirements. We need to make sure our critical infrastructures are more resilient than they currently are. Absolutely. And this aligns well with that. So it's the policy levers and the procurement, to make these critical infrastructures, both government as well as other regulated sectors, make sure they're on a path to being quantum safe in due time.
On the enablement piece, and that's maybe we'll talk about the cross-boundary enablement piece, not only in industry, but down to academia and how you get access to a workforce to help you in this area. Michele, in your paper, you talk not only about the timeline that it takes to have, fault-tolerant, quantum computers that can actually, be useful, but you also talk about I'm going to use the migration time and the threat timeline have to, kind of balance themselves out. And if I looked at, okay, we think in 10 years we'll have, something that's going to be either threatening us or an opportunity we can take advantage of, backing it up from there, where are you developing that workforce? Who's going to be there? Because if it's all there in the next 5 to 10 years, how are, is it going to be up to industry? How can industry and academia work together to do this? I mean, this is, I think back of the late 70s. Okay, I'll date myself, but when you started into doing programming back then, and there were some languages being developed, a lot of the education was on the job. If you entered the field in the late 70s, early 80s. So is there anything that you're seeing afoot on a combination of that? Because that's a workforce that we're going to need in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's hard to play catch up on that, right? I remember in the 80s, I was programming, and my family in Europe, they hadn't even seen a computer before. So I think that gave us a leg up in North America in this emerging next generation technology, and it's really hard to play catch up. It takes years to develop those things. So there's certainly lots of glimmers of hope, but we definitely need to amplify that. And there's a chicken and egg where we need, if there was more people looking ahead and preparing, that would be a greater stimulus to prepare these programs. So there's a chicken and egg where if organizations look ahead and start asking for these training initiatives, then there's more time to prepare them properly. So we're just in the middle. We're near the end of a Quantum Safe Canada is producing a workforce assessment for quantum safe crypto, which is one piece of the quantum workforce, but that should be coming out shortly to give us a view of what are the skills we're going to need over the next decade and where might we get them. So it's still a work in progress. We're certainly, I've not seen a coherent response to that obvious need. There's pockets of activity, but nothing widespread or coherent at this point.
Joy, I see you nodding. That I see you inching to jump in on this topic.
I completely agree. I think it's so difficult. This is actually one of the strategic objectives we also have for Europe, because I'll tell you, it's a bit of an anecdote. So every time we have these meetings with the rest of the countries in the Commission, at a certain point, someone, will talk about where should you do what and what does it look like and where does the money go and where are the projects, blah, blah. And at some point, someone will say something like, but what about Portugal? Or what about Malta? And it becomes a little bit of a Eurovision Song Festival thing, because you have to kind of spread it evenly across all of the things. But it becomes really difficult to spread this evenly without having strong talent and a continuous cycle of growth and innovation. It becomes very difficult to justify an even distribution of all of these resources. And I think that actually trying to get the people ready is going to be the biggest fundamental challenge we see in Europe. To embrace these technologies, you need to have companies consuming it. You need to have these companies invested with talent that's already there that knows what can be done with this technology. It's not enough to say, if we build it, they will come, because they will not.
Yeah. I think that it's definitely a big challenge. And one last question, maybe, to kind of throw out to the group, and then we've got a lot of great questions in the chat, but I'm not going to be able to deal with everything. And just for those who've sent me a message, we will share both a write-up and the audio tape of this, so that if you need to if you missed part of it, you can rehear it, because some people had trouble coming in at the beginning. What's next, I think, is a big question for everybody. Where do we go next with all of this, and how do we keep going to advance things? A lot of the questions that I'm seeing have to do with, the coordination points that are needed. Is the banking sector, and maybe Steve, I'll ask you to comment on this part, and then I'll ask Bob for some input also. You're seeing, you mentioned that you and your colleagues are working together. Is there anything else that's needed? Do you feel you're giving us a sense that there is coordination, that there is a sharing of ideas, but is there anything else that we should be worried about, or that we should be thinking about moving forward?
I think that, we're watching the developments in terms of what's coming out of NIST very closely, because we want to take a look at those algorithms and understand them and how they apply. We would need to talk to vendors and see how they're planning on addressing this. So I think there's a lot more is going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months. I think the activity level is going to go up dramatically. I think most of us have been talking about inventorying our systems and making sure we're ready for the developments that are coming out in the near future. One of the things we need to do, back to the training point, is making sure we have some staff designated to focus on this area, and that they're not trying to do it, as we say, on the corner of their desk to, I'm responsible for operating all these crypto things today, but I'm also going to go do all this research and get ready for the future. It's hard to do both things at the same time. So, making some committed investments in staff and people and training. And, back to the earlier points, I think the thing I would love to see is training on these subjects introduced, not just at the university level, but back to the high school and the primary school. I totally agree with Mikkel's points. I got trained I had the opportunity to learn how to program when I was 12 years old back in the 70s. And, you know, that led to me introducing computers in my role at the bank where I came in. I was so familiar with them and knew how to use them. We need to start early, right? We need to start early and make sure we groom that workforce generation. Just using cybersecurity as an example, there are 1.5 million job vacancies for cybersecurity professionals around the world right now. They're hard to find, and this is a threat to the world, and it's also a big opportunity for Canadians. So if we invest in training our resources in whether it's cyber or quantum, these are things that are going to be in high demand skills in the future, and we're going to pave a good future for Canadians. I think that's really important.
Thanks, Dave. Bob, a few more comments?
Yeah, so in terms of what's next, I mean, you know, we're in, as Steve observes, this period where we don't yet have the technology that we're going to use to fix the problem, right? So what do we do? Well, I mean, what I have been advising people to do is basically 4 things. First of all, nobody ever fixed a problem that nobody was responsible for, right? So I would say every organization needs to designate some named person, an executive at an appropriate level, as responsible for the quantum safety and quantum transition, right? So just pick somebody. You know, you don't have to do like a lot of investigation into background and expertise, because nobody has the relevant expertise. We haven't done this before, so just pick some poor bastard and say you're it, right? And it'll be, pick somebody who's like you know, under 40, because the rest of their career will be you know, will be defined by this. Second, I would say inventory, as Steve said, you know, figure out what you have today that is going to be the problem tomorrow. Then assessment, you know, take a look at the inventory of all your crypto stuff and figure out which of it is going to break and which of it isn't. And then the thing that I always ask people, you know, whenever I talk to a startup or whenever I talk to a big organization or anything, do exercises, right? Conduct tabletop exercises. Imagine that you have to replace all of your public key certificates over the course of the next week because something bad has happened to cryptography. That can happen even without a quantum computer, right? It'll be a really useful exercise. Do the exercise. You'll be horrified, right? So arrange in advance not to tell very many people because it'll be embarrassing and shocking, right? But do the exercise, right? Do the exercise of installing a new cryptographic protocol in some system. You don't actually have to, you know, push the buttons, right? But figure out, I mean, like if you do the tabletop exercise, you'll discover, you know, that the guy who was your crypto implementation expert retired last year, right? And or whatever. So do exercises, figure out the scenarios that you're going to have to go through, start practicing for them, because you don't want to do this for the first time the day that NIST says, you know, here you go, or the day that Microsoft says, here you go. You want to have practiced this before you play the Super Bowl.
Great, thanks, Bob. I think with that, I mean, we've come to it's been very quick. We've come to the top of the hour already. So I think those are very good parting words for the people who've come. I think we're going to end up doing another one of these sessions, and I don't think in too long a period of time, probably before the end of the year when we get our next installment on the next quantum threat timeline. And I think it'd be useful to see what's progressed, and I would like to take a moment to thank you very much to all of our panelists, Steve, Michele, Jaya, and Bob. Thanks very much for your participation today. For the attendees who are jumping off because they're moving on to their next meeting, thank you very much. There's a survey that will pop up. Please take the time to answer it. And for our members GRI members who are on, a couple more webinars coming up in the next month on macroeconomic series. Stay tuned for some invitations on that. With that, thanks very much, panel. I think we should have scheduled an extra half hour. Maybe next time we will do that. So, and we'll send some summaries out to the attendees, and I'll share with you the Q&As that we might put that out in the summaries too. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.